So, welcome everybody. This is panel one, Dictionaries and Decolonization of English of the Oxford World English Symposium. My name's Sean, and I'm just here to do a little bit of housekeeping. And you can see the panelists are all ready to go. Okay, that's a housekeeping done. So let's get panel one underway. And I'm going to hand over to the moderator, Danica, now. Enjoy the panel, folks.
Thank you, Sean, and everyone. Welcome to the first of four panel discussions we're having today, day 2 of the Oxford World English Symposium. My name is Danica Salazar. Once again, I am Executive Editor for World Englishes for Oxford Languages, and I am the moderator of this panel on dictionaries and the decolonization of English. It is indeed a great privilege to be here with all of you this morning. Well, morning for me at least, joined by my esteemed co-panelists. So let me now introduce them to all of you. So we have Professor Phil Benson, Professor of Applied Linguistics and Director of the Multilingualism Research Center at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Dr. Gui Lee Sui, a Singaporean poet, graphic artist, and literary critic, author of Singapore's first long-form graphic novel, as well as volumes of verse, best-selling nonfiction titles, and Singlish translations of classic works of literature. Dr. Quentin Williams, Director of the Center for Multilingualism and Diversities Research, and an Associate Professor of Social Linguistics in the Linguistics Department at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. And finally, we have Mr. Kola Tubosun, a Nigerian writer, linguist, teacher, author of 2 collections of poetry, a Yoruba Dictionary of Names at yorubaname.com, and several works in translation between English and Yoruba. Kola, Quentin, Gui, Phil, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
I would like to start our conversation by asking you to please describe the use of English in the region you're from or in which you work right now, and how colonialism continues to impact it. I know colonialism right off the bat, but this is a panel on decolonization after all. So could you describe the continuing impact of colonialism on your variety of English and how you're researching or working towards the decolonization of language and our lexicography? Let's start with you, Phil.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here. If I could just say a little bit about myself and why is this Englishman doing here talking about World Englishes. Basically, I was born and grew up in Manchester in the north of England. And when I went to university, I moved to the south of England and later went into English language teaching. And just that experience made me very aware and conscious of the fact that although I learned to write standard British English at school, I didn't actually speak standard British English myself. And at that time, if you were going into the English language teaching industry, that was actually a problem. It was changing, but it would mean certainly you wouldn't have got a job. I would never have got a job with the British Council because when I went to the interview, they'd have listened to me for 30 seconds and said no. But I did manage to make a career in ELT, and that kind of situation has changed quite a lot nowadays for native speakers, but of course much less so for non-native speakers of English who still facing a lot of issues in regard to employment in the ELT industry. Now, the reason I mention that is simply because even now, if I look, for example, at the IPA transcriptions of standard of British English in the Oxford English Dictionary, they don't necessarily match the way that I speak. Similarly, the IPA in textbooks and so on, I have to kind of translate it to the way that I would say a word or the way that I should be teaching a word. So I just mentioned that because, later I worked in Malaysia and I became an observer of Malaysian English. I made contributions to the Macquarie Dictionary in Australia, a whole bunch of words, Malaysian English words. And similarly, I did the same in Hong Kong, where I lived for about 20 years. Actually, that should have been done by people who spoke those varieties of English, but at that time it wasn't being done. Now it is being done by people who speak those varieties of English, and that's great. So to get to just to your question about Australian English, about Australia and English in Australia, where I'm living now, I just wanted to mention three things that makes the situation of Australian English and its relation to colonialism really quite an interesting one. Is that the first is, of course, that Australia was a colony, was a British colony. So Australian English actually shares a surprising number of features with, for example, Singaporean English or Nigerian English. I'm not sure if you use, in Nigeria, would you use the word outstation? Certainly, no. I think in Singapore, Malaysia, you use the word outstation or station. And this is used in Australia. Station, certainly, and outstation less frequently. So even some words are shared. So there is that aspect of it. But the other aspect that I think is very important is that Australia itself is a colonizer in the Pacific region, and of course in relation to the Aboriginal population of Australia. So we also have to take into account Aboriginal English and various Englishes in places like Papua New Guinea and other parts of the Pacific, and how those have also influenced Australian English itself. So Australia is both so the colonial influence works both ways. Australia sort of kind of passes on a British colonial influence to other parts of this region. And the last one, the third point I wanted to mention about Australian English is that Australia has become very much a kind of global post-colonial country as well. So actually 20% of the population of Australia, we tend to think of Australian English as a native speaker variety of English, but 20% of the population of Australia now speaks English as a second language. And in Sydney, that's around 40%. So all of the sort of global varieties of world Englishes are present here. And there's this, we got this melting point. Some people have talked about multicultural Sydney English as a kind of parallel to multicultural London English. I'm not quite sure how strong that is, but just one example. I think one word that's supposed to be an Australian word is, I don't know if you're familiar with the word eat-swa, which means sweet. It's a back slang, big Latin. It's sweet, pronounced backwards. And there's quite a successful rap song here in Australia, which is called "Tell 'Em I'm Doing Eat-swa." If they ask you how I'm doing, brah, tell them I'm doing eat-swa. And this is a kind of particularly through Arabic speakers' influence on the language in Sydney. It's become a kind of youth language. So let me stop there.
All right, thank you, Phil. How very interesting situation in Australia. So how about you, Wee? So let's move up to Singapore now. In your particular situation there.
Hello from Singapore. Maybe I should start with a bit of introduction about myself, since
yes, please do.
I've done by doing that. Well, if you're wondering about my doctorate, it's actually in 18th century English and European literature. Very different from what I'm doing now these days as a writer, poet, and an artist. I think that shift is itself a kind of history that we can, I'm not sure whether you want to hear it, but we can talk about it later, I think, in relation to the issues that I'd like to raise. But from Singapore, I'd like to give a kind of context, I guess, to how English has moved from colonial times to it is now, the way it is used, and how it's become a very integral part of society. I think really, ironically, it's tied very much, the things that we consider part of Singapore's success is tied to this aspect of colonialism that we have brought into who we are. And I guess we can think about it in two aspects of English. English, I mean, in Singapore, which is a multiracial, multicultural society, is a means to communicate across different ethnic, linguistic communities. And that has been the way the colonialists have used English to govern, to administer the place. And so, when we achieved independence, it was pretty much kept as a kind of neutral language, as the language zero that that is not favoring any particular communities, but is at the same time having a history of being able to bring people together. And so it was kept as that in a very ironic way, as the language that we much prefer to speak in, that it is seemingly, even though it had at past a seemingly more objective language to be used, more unproblematic language to be used. And that functionality that is attached to English is also attached to, therefore, this perception of how you use language. It is not necessarily something we think deeply about English as part of identity, but as a language out of necessity, that you need it to communicate, to be part of the world, and may not necessarily be tied to your cultural identity. And so, and that bit has, there's a bit of discussion going on still about that. And the second aspect, of course, is that since we are tying English so much to institutional social functionality, it is also tied, therefore, to the aspect that we often celebrate as a key to our success, which is meritocracy. In that way, English becomes tied as a kind of class marker, so that if you're very competent in English, you can belong much more easily to the kind of system in which the educated, the more skilled rule. And so in that way, English is very much a kind of a rule to which you rise, I guess, in this kind of society. And so, as in that sense, even though every Singaporean speak another language, we are all bilingual in a way. We all still speak English as the primary language, and then we speak, of course, our ethnic or the language that you much prefer to speak officially. So there is either Mandarin, Tamil, or Malay. Those are considered the kind of other language that you have to pick up in school, and this has been implemented since independence. And with that, I guess that there are a lot of lingering biases that comes into the use of English, and I you can really trace it all the way back to this preference of using English. And one of it is strangely, whether it's said or not, if you have an Anglo-American accent, that is very much preferred as opposed to a Singaporean accent. So strangely, if you speak ungrammatical English with an Anglo-American accent, that is, still in very much preferred than if you were to speak proper English with a Singaporean accent. And that kind of bias is very problematic, but it exists there. And secondly, there's also the preference for functional English that's used in a pragmatic day-to-day way, as opposed to literary and cultural English, furthering English in a way that is very much part of who we are. And so adapting the language, changing the language, having fun with the language, that is opposed to the kind of function institutional language. And thirdly, on that note, if you were to play around too much with language, you get confused with, the perception that you are speaking poorly used English, and therefore you are, in a sense, engaging with kind of low socioeconomic status, because their perception is that, people who are of a low socio-economic class speaks broken English. And therefore, if you were to speak something of a variety like Singlish, it is automatically considered bad English, as if they are the same thing. And on that note, therefore, you are either, making fun of people of the lower class, or you yourself, are not comprehending or trying to help other people of that class rise up. Not realizing, of course, given that Singapore is part of a very socially mobile society, a lot of us who speak English, like me, we didn't come from very well-to-do family, and yet, nonetheless, having risen, we have kept that part as part of identity. It is not about repressing social class, but very much part of who we are. So I'm just going to stop there, and we can talk further about Singapore's situation.
Yes, we'll explore that further later on in this panel. So let's move on now to Quentin. Could you talk a little bit about yourself, your background, and your
Yeah,
specific
yeah.
situation in Africa?
Wonderful. I just want to say I'm happy and I'm honored to be here on this panel. And I sort of the discussions opened up by Phil and Gui brought me to my own interest in English, mainly in a variety, a highly racialized variety of English in South Africa, and that is the so-called colored English, or what we understand also as the Cape Flats English. And I, in my dissertation work on hip hop in South Africa, I really got an understanding of the remixing of English with carbs and other varieties used by youth to refashion their identities and ontologies, and for how they see themselves as speakers, as multilingual speakers within the South African context. But I mean, and I think my experience of English in scholarship, or South African English in scholarship, and English in the everyday spaces used by multilingual speakers it shows up contradictions between how linguists who study English in South Africa want to see the use of English, and the speakers who actually use English. Give you an instructive example. It's a very recent example. There was a request outside South Africa by German linguists to ask for so-called colored English examples and so-called black South African English examples. And I was completely horrified at this, because what they outside understand about South African English, that it remains such a highly racialized form of English with various varieties, and it's based on what I call apartheid or colonial linguistics. That is sort of brought forward in post-apartheid South Africa, that sustains a particular idea of the South African English speaker. So there is this Cape Flats English speaker, there's so-called Cape Colored English speaker, the so-called Black South African English speaker, but no questions were asked about examples about white South African English, which is the sort of unmarked or apparently unmarked variety, which I found extremely vexing, because it sustains a body of variationist social linguistics that is erroneously, sometimes, perhaps not all the time, drawn on by dictionary makers in South Africa. And I'm not going to out who sent me the request, but I did send them the reply that when it comes to South African English, there needs to be the sort of work done to, well, deracialize is probably the wrong word, but to critically address the continued racialization of South African Englishes, and sustaining sort of very weak characteristics of so-called black or so-called colored South African English speakers. Just to end, I'll say this, that the whole idea of so-called colored English is based on an invention by logopedic or speech therapists at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, who had unfettered access to so-called colored speakers on the Cape Flats, which is a sort of 20-mile, the sort of the equivalent of the favelas in South Africa. They had unfettered access because they were doing the work in apartheid. They were white and they had access to all of these speakers in clinics and so forth and so on. But that body of knowledge that is based on very little data is still sustained by variationist social linguists in South Africa. Not all of them, but the ones who have the power to continue to shape the scholarship, they do so. And unfortunately, I must say, this informs policy on language, and also language human rights activism and wants and desires. So I'll leave it at that. But that's how I come to it. And you'll see later, it informs also the trilingual dictionary of carbs.
Right. Thank you, Quentin. Yeah, we'll talk more about the trilingual dictionary of CAPS. Now we go to Kola. Welcome. And could you tell
Thank
us
you.
more about yourself and your linguistic situation in Nigeria?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. My name is Kola. I'm a linguist, and I've worked as a lexicographer, also as a high school teacher of English in Nigeria. And I'll give you a little background of what English language is like in Nigeria today. One from the perspective of a citizen and one perspective of a teacher of English. English language has been with us for over at least 100 years when the British were there, between 1860 or thereabouts to 1960 when they left. So it was a part of the governance structure. It was the language of government, language of society, of high society, an aspirational language. Just like Dr. Sui said, in Singapore, it became eventually a kind of what was said to be a neutral language, which was supposed to unite the whole country that had over 500 different languages. However, when the British left in 1960, the people who took over did not re-examine that supposition that one language is capable of really uniting people in terms of culture and in terms of outlook and all of that. And even till today, you still have the mindset that without English language, we will not be a nation, so to speak. Like I said, we have many languages, over 500, but there are like major languages, a handful of major languages: Igbo, Hausa, Yoruba, Ibibio, Edo, etc. But unlike in Singapore, they're not used in schools. They used to be taught in schools as an elective, which students had to take along with English. English was a medium of instruction. But over time, the attitude of society to Nigerian languages, which had been bad from colonial conditioning, got worse. And when I was growing up, if you spoke any other language in school, you were going to be punished. You had to be English language. And so now we don't have any Nigerian language taught in any public schools, even private schools, not at all. And so it has affected the way African languages are taught in Nigeria or are acquired. So we estimate that in a couple of generations, many Nigerian languages will be extinct just because of how English has dominated the space. But importantly, as a teacher, one of the things I've realized is also that the RP that was mandated as the official language of English has in society changed and evolved over the years. If you listen to the people, the politicians, Nigerian politicians who spoke in the 60s, you would see that many of them spoke almost like British, high society people, because they had gone to school in England, they had interacted with British colonial masters, many of whom lived in Nigeria as well. And many of the people in society also spoke like that. And so it reflected again how we taught the English in school. But over time, the Nigerian English we have today has evolved into a different kind of English with different phonology. There are many ways we speak English differently from how it used to be spoken. The stress patterns have changed depending. These are highly influenced by local language speech. And so we have evolved what we call the Nigerian English, which has, again, the different phonology, sometimes a different syntax, and certainly a number of different lexical items. And Oxford Dictionary, sometimes 2 years ago, added at least 29 of such lexicon from Nigerian English into the OED. But even before then, many people have worked on dictionaries, personal dictionaries of Nigerian English, to document many of these changes that have happened over the years. Now, in schools, unfortunately, the changes that have happened in society has not reflected. So you have teachers still forcing students to learn RP in class, and students finding it really weird that the way they speak outside of the classroom is not reflected in the way the syllabus is taught. And that creates a kind of, I think, a disconnect, because students have to pass the subjects to be able to proceed to universities. English language credit is a compulsory course for every Nigerian student. Even if you're studying mathematics or you're studying a Greek, it doesn't matter. You have to get a credit pass in English. And if you're in class and you're teaching them that they have to speak in this certain way, or you have to learn how to use a certain way, sometimes it's a tough battle. As a teacher, I know that. And usually what I tell the students is, I know that you speak in a different way, but forget about how you speak when you get to the class. At least learn the rules of RP first, and then you can speak however you like. I'm of the opinion that it would be best if our syllabus reflects the current state of Nigerian English on the outside of the classroom. And much work has been done in that regard by many linguists and professors. We just need to find a way to incorporate it into the academic syllabus. So much of my work has been to kind of find opportunities in which to highlight these issues between how things are and how things could be. I've worked at Google, for instance. I led the team that created the Google Assistant for Nigerian English, which is a Google voice, artificial intelligence voice, like that one that talks to you on your map, that speaks in Nigerian English accents other than the standard British English that we used to have. I've also done a lot of essay writing on many of the issues that exist, including why we have to write tests of English as a foreign language before we go to universities abroad, and a number of other issues like that. I'm also in literature, and I, as an editor of a literary magazine, I look forward to helping writers feel more confident in being able to use Nigerian English more than they used to before. We have to aspire to this huge, this standard, strict way of writing. But we believe that the time has come for the many ways in which we can express ourselves in the language to thrive in our literature. And that's one of the work I do in terms of decolonization. I hope we'll have more time to expound on this many
Yes,
issues.
definitely. Thank you, Paula. So, well, in my case, I am a native speaker of Philippine English, which is a very well-studied but still relatively minoritized variety of post-colonial English. So I think what makes it different from most post-colonial Englishes is that it was a result of American rather than British colonization. So we spell colonization with a Z, but all the context is very much similar to what Gui and Kola described about Nigerian English and Singapore English. Philippine English being used as like a common language among many different ethnic groups and as a language of mobility and social mobility. So I'm not going to repeat any of that stuff. It's all very similar situation. And in my current role in the OED, I lead editorial projects for improving the dictionary's coverage of world Englishes. And really one of the main goals of that work is to decolonize the dictionary. And although most of our work is well received, we still do get comments like, really, decolonization from Oxford, decolonization from the land of the colonizer, decolonization of language through a dictionary. I mean, isn't the very purpose of a dictionary to establish and promote a single, unified, unchanging standard English? So now this brings me to my question for you, Phil, because in 2001, you published a book titled Ethnocentrism in the Oxford English Dictionary, in which you argue that, and I quote you here, that the English dictionary is a historically specific form of discourse embedded within broader discourses that represent knowledge of the world in terms of metaphors of center and periphery. And when you talk of the center here, that's generally understood as standard British English or American English, and the periphery is everything else outside the standard. So could you explain to us a little bit this traditional function of dictionaries of establishing and maintaining what is standard and correct in a language?
Yeah, sure. Let me say, first of all, so it wasn't called ethnocentrism in the Oxford English Dictionary. It was called ethnocentrism in the English Dictionary.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, but I understand why you might think that, because the Oxford English Dictionary was kind of the main target. But I was actually referring to all English dictionaries, and I guess it's a kind of compliment to the Oxford English Dictionary that I saw it as the chief culprit, because it's clearly the biggest and the most comprehensive dictionary that we have. But yeah, so let me just first of all let me say what I meant by that phrase, a discourse, that the dictionary is a discourse on the language, because I think we're accustomed to the idea that a dictionary could be prescriptive in the sense that it tells you how to speak a language, or it could be descriptive, which is that it just describes the language as it is. And I think the modern view now, particularly the lexicographer's view, is that the dictionary describes the language as it is. It doesn't tell people how to use it. But of course, if you describe a standard language, then in effect, you're telling people what the standard is, and they can, it's kind of like, you know, I mean, I'm involved in lexicography myself, so I can take some responsibility. It's as if we're saying, well, we're not saying it's prescriptive, but if you'd like to read it prescriptively, that's your right, or that's your, you know, your problem in a way. Perhaps you don't understand what we're trying to do, but I think they do understand. But what I meant by the dictionary being a discourse on language is that it's actually dictionaries are books that are about the language, but they are also part of the language that they describe. So if you take a language such as English, you can't really consider English as a language separately from all of the dictionaries, the grammars, all of the commentary that's taken place on English over the centuries and so on. They are actually both part of the language, and at the same time they're a kind of meta commentary on the language at the same time. And I think if we look at it, say, historically, what we find is that basically English and the European languages, they have very big, comprehensive dictionaries. Other languages have smaller dictionaries. And then when we look at the, you know, minoritized languages or minoritized dialects or varieties of English, often they don't have a dictionary at all. Or they may have what I call a partial dictionary, which is, you know, it could be, say, a regional dictionary, which is just the words that I think Oxford calls them regional dictionaries. These are dictionaries that just have the words of that variety, but not the other words of English. Or, you know, they may be word lists or glossaries and so on. And that thing about whether you have a dictionary and the size of the dictionary and the number of dictionaries that you have, it very much relates to the status of of a language or a language variety. So basically, I mean, having a dictionary makes it a language. Yeah. Not having a dictionary makes it something else, a dialect or a variety, perhaps. So I think in terms of standardization and the notion of center and periphery, and so on, we need to really understand how the dictionary has produced the language, and in particular in English, how the dictionary has contributed to this production of English itself as a language that has a center and a kind of global, a British center and a global periphery. Now you mentioned that I said that the discourse on language was use this center and periphery metaphor, that actually the first editor of the OED, that's where I got the idea by reading the introduction to the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, where James Murray says it's like, he says it's a bit like the solar system. English is a bit like the solar system. It has a center, well-defined center, and a more diffuse periphery. Now, clearly, I think he did identify the center, and the dictionary has identified the center with standard British English. But I think what my understanding of the center and periphery is more in terms of how dictionaries have a core of language that defines the rest of the language. So basically, dictionaries have a defining vocabulary and a defined vocabulary. And the idea is that you're supposed to explain the difficult words by using the simple words. Now, those simple words, in a sense, are the core. But of course, when we look at that in a dictionary that's a dictionary of kind of world Englishes, then that simple vocabulary becomes the British vocabulary, and the sort of dispersed wider vocabulary of world Englishes becomes something that's kind of difficult and needs to be explained. So when that's kind of mapped onto world Englishes, what you get really is the idea that all of the various varieties of world Englishes are out there, and what we need to do is explain them in terms of British English. And it's that sense, I think, is a very important sense of the center and periphery, that in terms of decolonizing the dictionary, I think we need to, I mean, maybe I'll say a little bit more about this in conclusion, but it's not a question of how many sort of words we have from all the different varieties of English around the world. It's how we deal with them. It's whether we put those words on a kind of level playing field. That's the British expression of level playing field, or an equal platform, equal status with British English. If I've got, well, if you could give me one moment, I've got one example, I think. Could I just take 1 minute?
Yeah.
There's an example of how that works very insidiously, I think, with defining vocabulary and defined vocabulary. And just to give an example, I mean, I've worked as a teacher in Malaysia and in Hong Kong. And in both of those countries, well, the students will do their homework and then they have to give the homework to the teacher, right? So what do they do with the homework? Do they submit the homework to the teacher, or do they hand it in? Do they hand in the homework? So in both countries, in both Malaysia and Singapore, using English, kids will always say, can I submit my homework later, right? They won't say, can I hand in my homework? Yeah. Now, if you look in even a learner's dictionary, if you look up the word submit, the definition will be something like hand in. If you look up hand in, there will be some explanation of what hand in means. Yeah, but you won't define hand in. You won't see hand in and then the definition is submit. But for a kid in Hong Kong, and I think I can see some of you nodding, for a kid in Hong Kong, actually submit is the normal word. It's the easier word. And this is to do with the defining vocabulary is actually not only, it's not only British English, it's actually Anglo-Saxon. You know, so all of those and these phrasal verbs, which are actually difficult to learn for a lot of second language speakers of English, these phrasal verbs that are very natural for native speakers of English. You know, it's because they're Anglo-Saxon and they're not Latin or French origin. So this is, to me, is a very insidious way, actually, that the British dictionaries particularly kind of, you know, work with this core and periphery language in ways that actually make the dictionaries quite difficult to use. So
I think we need to move on now to the but I just like to say, Phil, that yeah, sorry for misrepresenting the title of your book there, but I feel it's just read it in the light of, it's just that I've always read it in the light
I'll change the title.
My work on the OED. And you know, and you really rightly point out that some of the ethnocentrism of the OED and its earlier editions, especially when attitudes towards language and diversity were different, and also even today, some of those British-centric features that you've just described may still be hanging around in among the 600,000 entries in the dictionary. And all that we can really do is to identify these and address them as soon as possible during the revision program. But you know, the fact is that there is really this seeming contradiction between the OED's our very serious and very sincere drive towards decolonization, and you know, the perception among people of an Oxford dictionary as being symbolic of British colonialism and, you know, of a standard English. So what we're really trying to do here is turn that on its head, you know, because when the OED does something, people listen, and so why not use that, you know, as you said. You know, because as we're saying, there's this linguistic ideology that makes dictionaries just like the most effective tool in promoting, you know, the very existence of a language. So we can turn that around and use this ideology for good, as Philip Sturgeon suggested in 2011. You know, by documenting words from varieties of English that are marginalized in a dictionary as trusted as the OED, it is possible to use this ideology to change the way that these varieties are perceived. So there's this quote from a lexicographer in Macquarie Dictionary, Susan Butler. She said in 1997, being able to say that your words are in a dictionary in general has more effect on the public perception of the validity of a variety than many words spent in linguistic theorizing like we're doing now. So I think that dictionaries have a very important role to play in decolonization there. So now that we're on the subject of attitudes towards language, Kola, in your writing, you often comment on the perception of Nigerians themselves of Nigerian English being inherently inferior. So it seems that you talked about your work on the Google Assistant Nigerian English voice, and you said that this ran into some acceptance problems for a while. So could you tell us more about this, and are you seeing any potential for change in this negative view of Nigerian English?
Yes, it's always very interesting. I remember when before the I was at Google before the product was, before we finished. I think as soon as we were starting, actually, one of my my colleagues asked, "What do you think is going to happen when this voice comes out? Do you think Nigerians are going to embrace it and stuff like that?" And I said, "Well, it's quite a very complex case. You will find many Nigerians who find it very interesting and as something really, really unique and exciting, and you'll find many people who think it's it's demeaning the language. It's making the English they love into something trivial. But I said it's important to note that no matter what people think, it's an important work to do, and that there will be people, especially Nigerians, ironically Nigerians who don't live in Nigeria, who would find this really, really interesting and who would embrace it. And when it came out, it turned out to be the case. Actually, before they announced the product, many people had started seeing changes on their phones, and they started hearing the Nigerian English voice rather than the old British English or American English accent. And they started commenting on Twitter, and many of the comments were so hilarious. Some were angry, some were just surprised, some were it was very. I started documenting and retweeting many of them. And then, of course, they figured out that Google was doing that. But before then, it was just interesting to hear people say, "Oh, why was my phone sounding like me?" If I wanted someone to sound like me, I could just talk to my friend. If I want to use my phone, I want to hear a foreign voice. So in some way, it's aspirational. There are people who want to use devices because they want to learn how to speak like a British person or an American person. And that's why they watch American movies. And if you listen to Nigerian radio, you will hear a number of people with this weird accents that for sure is not a Nigerian English accent, and you can't place in any foreign space. You can't say the Chicago American or British, but it is, in the estimation of the person using it, an elevated type of English, so which we now call it Lekki British accent. Basically, it's a kind of Lagos high society accent, but the people speaking it, they assume it's a foreign and polished type of English. So there is that battle between not wanting to speak like you ordinarily would, putting an effort into making sure that you sound posh and polished. And in that case, they end up in this weird space that is not foreign and is not Nigerian. So that was why I think many people reacted in a visceral way. But overall, many people eventually warmed up to the idea of having a phone that can speak in an accent that ordinary people, taxi drivers, can understand when they're driving. Before then, Uber drivers had complained that they would hear the street name on the map, and because it was pronounced by a British voice which didn't understand the names, they would miss the turns and all of that. But finally, they had something they could actually use. So I guess people who many of these were like middle class, upper class, educated people who were upset. I think eventually they figured out that the drivers could figure out where they were going much better, and it was something that actually eventually benefited them. And with the work of other people, linguists who are public like me, we have, I think, sort of been able to keep that in the mind of the public as an important and relevant work to make sure that there is nobody says you shouldn't try to speak as clearly as you can, as good as you can, but that having devices that that can speak in the way you can really understand, where you don't have to strain, you don't have to stress yourself, is a good thing. And that is also why we complain that we have to write test of English as a foreign language, which is like saying how we speak in Nigeria is not an authentic way of speaking the language, when it obviously is, and it's our own way of speaking, just like there are variants in other parts of the world. So yeah, so that's the current situation. There will continue to be people who feel that if they're not speaking the perfect, so-called perfect variant, which they have seen in movies and on the BBC, that they're not speaking the best way that they could. It's, again, I can understand the aspirational aspect of it, but most people now, I think, get an idea that there is nothing wrong in being comfortable in how you speak your own language.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, I resisted using digital home assistants just because they couldn't understand me. Now moving on now to Gui. This deficit mentality that we've just been talking about, that Kola has just mentioned, towards localized varieties of English, it's not really unique to Nigeria. I mean, it's widespread throughout all post-colonial Anglophone societies. It's the same in the Philippines, and in the same in where you're from, in Singapore. And I distinctly remember hanging out with you in a hawker center in Singapore in 2016, where your piece in the New York Times advocating Singlish had just been published, and the OED had just published a batch of new words of representing Singapore English and Singlish. And I remember us causing quite a stir when that happened. So despite some resistance from your fellow Singaporeans, you continue to champion Singlish and Singapore English and use it in your creative work. So why do you persist? Why do you think it is important for Singlish and Singapore English to be used as a medium of literary expression? And how do you think creative writers such as yourself can contribute to the decolonization of English?
Thanks, Dinika. I really remember that moment, because it was in my life, at least at that point, it was just pretty turbulent, because after that, especially after the government had to respond to my New York Times article, there was quite a stir nationally, where you have people literally camping on both sides and fighting over the issue, because they do think that the future, economic future of Singapore is in a way at stake, depending on how you take as attitude towards it. And some of them are pretty horrified that OED would validate these words. So it really is a very a real struggle here. Having to, I wouldn't use the word champion, because this is how I speak all the time. As long as people keep speaking, and I don't think they can stop speaking Singlish, they are in that way already fighting the fight, by just living their normal linguistic life. So my role, I guess, is to, as a writer, is to really draw attention to the fracture, the way we perceive or fail to perceive the reality. I do think that my project is more a kind of a project of self-awareness, to help people to see that there is a discrepancy between how you think language ought to be, what language ought to be, and how you're actually saying it and promoting or going against certain things. If we believe that language is very much part of who we are as individuals, separate from what the state may say or what is taught to you from your parents about the supremacy of English and all that, then you should have a kind of more forward-looking attitude towards the formation of Singlish. And if you also have a clearer understanding of the history of English itself, how in its history it was made up of many other languages coming together, then in that sense, we are actually seeing the genesis of a kind of new language, and we should be excited and protective of this linguistic baby we have, as opposed to, just coming down at it and killing it. And so there is that very, real struggle we have, trying to tell people that, yes, you have to be able to differentiate between bad English and Singlish. Singlish, if you start to look at it in a broader way, it is really very different from English. We still talk, I guess, about Singlish as an English variant, but in many ways it has evolved beyond that, because it embraces also synthetic styles, not just words and all from the other languages. And therefore, it's changing depending on which communities you move with and their competency with English or interest in English. I mean, the language does change. And so in a sense, it's quite mobile in a sense that in a way that you really can't document properly how it is used in different communities. And yet, if you have an entry point into Singlish, depending on the communities you move into, you are able to adapt your Singlish so that it can be understood. So it already, in a sense, has a different life from English itself. And I guess for Singapore, we have to really move away from just thinking about bilingualism or multilingualism towards code switching as the real a skill in learning languages or mastering languages for the future.
That's a a talk yesterday by our Indian English consultant and OED, Professor Paul Ganashkar, where he talked about developing a linguistic repertoire among Indians that includes not just English, but all languages and all these linguistic skills that Indians have, including code switching, including being able to change from the different languages that they use. Now, but variation occurs not just in English, but in all languages. And actually, Quentin here is working on a dictionary of caps, which is a variety of Afrikaans that's also often seen, just like Singlish, is often seen as inferior and unworthy of documentation. Could you tell, Quentin, could you now tell us about caps? Why do you think it's important to create a dictionary?
Right.
And what lessons can we learn from your experience working on caps that we can apply to the documentation of English?
Yeah, I think the development of this dictionary, and it's been a complete wild ride since we announced the making of this dictionary, because for a lot of the speakers it seems like a dream come true. Finally, we have reached this point, and just making the dictionary is an act of decolonization. And for this fact, we are reaching so far back to understand some of the structural usages of and influences of not only English but also Dutch and many other languages that make up CAPS. We call it a language, and that in itself is also a decolonial act, and not necessarily a variety of Afrikaans. It happens to say in the grammar and the vocabulary of Afrikaans, but when you look at the etymology of the lemmas that we have in our corpus and the history of formation of CAPS, it is a language in this sense that it is a system of signs. Those signs are non-verbal and verbal. It's governed by rules and used by a community of speakers. And for many scholars, they seem to now think that there's a new body of research emerging. And I keep on saying, well, it's a very basic definition of language. Okay, it's a bit Sausorian, but it's very basic and it works for the speakers. But this language was first used by the indigenous and enslaved populations at the Cape, in Cape Town. And it mostly developed amongst the enslaved in contact with the Khoisan and Ku and San languages and other speakers that was brought to the Cape as slaves from Africa, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and Madagascar, for example. The words kopi pirang, they are not, that we still use today in Afrikaans and CAPS, does not originate from Afrikaans or even Dutch, but it comes from old Javanese or Javanese. So at the Cape at the time, you had all these languages, but also Creole Portuguese, and of course Dutch, English, and Bazaar Malay, and also Arabic. And the Cape was extremely multilingual, but out of this multilinguality emerges CAPS as a form of vernacular Dutch and influenced by English, because we still use like gefocus, which is a remnant of the Khoi sort of affixing to English words. But anyway, it emerges as a form of vernacular Dutch, influenced by English, but then gets steadily erased in the controlling and power domains as a result of the decreolization and standardization of Afrikaans.
Thank you, Quentin. Yeah, so I think that we have just a little over half an hour left. So I'm really struggling here between, you know, my timekeeping duties as a
Sure.
moderator and my desire to just sit here and talk to you guys about these issues for the rest of the day. So I have a few more questions, but we have to ask you to be a bit more brief in our answers
Sure.
as we wrap up. So we'll have time to answer questions
Yeah.
from the audience. But please do, we'll continue the conversation. So, going back to Cola, you have pointed out that there are just not enough dictionaries of Nigerian English, and Quentin has just outlined to us just how important, how just the very creation of dictionaries is an act of decolonization. So, and even with the OED widening its coverage of Nigerian English, you do believe that it's not really sufficient just to have the OED alone as reference, and in local Nigerian, and you've told me that local Nigerian English dictionary might be a good opportunity to document the evolution of Nigerian English over the years. And I completely agree with this, because I think that the best way to decolonize English lexicography is not only to include World English words in general dictionaries, which is also very important, but also to have more locally produced dictionaries of specific varieties of English. So could you comment more on this, and also tell us, what do you think are the characteristics of a truly decolonized dictionary of Nigerian English? So I pose that question first to Kola, and then I would like to ask the rest of you to wrap up this first part of our conversation by telling me, what do you think are the characteristics of a truly decolonized dictionary of Nigerian English? Kola?
Yes, thank you for that. I think even the very existence of the Nigerian English Dictionary is an act of decolonization. Just the idea that we have a place where you can find anything you need to know about, all the words that have existed over these years in Nigerian English. I mean, occasionally we find them in Oxford dictionaries or other foreign dictionaries. Dashiki has entered the dictionaries in, I think, 1975 or thereabouts. A couple more entered 2 years ago. And like you said, many people in Nigeria, get really excited that, oh, these new words have entered OED. More than the fact that the words have been in use in Nigeria over all these years. You would assume that they'd be more excited that the word exists and we've been using it than the fact that an institution like OED has accepted it. I understand the problem. I understand the fact that, it's not a problem. I understand the reality that OED is an institution and it's a global institution, and everybody sees that and they want to be a part of it. But the work that linguists and scholars and researchers have been doing over the years is worthy of documentation and celebration. And I think a colleague of mine, Kingsley, is part of the panel we have today. He's also, done some work in Englishes. And there's this dictionary by Roger Blench, which was, I think, the first one I ever saw, English dictionary. But many other people have done a lot of work. Herbert Igboanosi in University of Ibadan has done some work in that regard. But they are not in one place. They're not coordinated. They're not popularized. But most importantly, they are not incorporated into the educational syllabus, which I think is really where it needs to be. I think if we look at our educational syllabus and we plan it in such a way that the work the linguists and scholars, researchers are doing reflects in the way we teach our students, then we have succeeded. We have successfully decolonized the language. Because now there are still these two divides in that, they go on the street, they speak in the way they normally will, and then they go to classroom and they realize that that is not recognized in any way at all. So until that happens, until that coordination happens, I think we still have a long way to
go. Quentin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think for us, the important thing of for the CARP speaker is that he or she is exposed to English, their own variety of English, and CARPs for the first 6 years of their life. But when they get to school, they have to start learning in a foreign language, and that's standard Afrikaans. But when we announced this dictionary, we engaged in a sort of public lexicography, not in the Habermasian sense, but in a sort of Michael Borroway sense, sort of to really translate lexicography to the wider speakers of CARPs. And what we found is that etymology, and including etymology of lemmas in in the dictionary is of vital importance to show the speaker that your language that you speak originates not only way back to colonial times, but it goes as far back to Indonesia. It's influenced heavily by Old Javanese. I'll give an example. The word aware is a greeting word that I use because Kaps is my first language. We use it on a daily basis. But it is it's a word that was transformed in colonial times from Old Javanese where it's used as a verb to a greeting word. In Old Javanese, where aware means to give. And so this where aware to give turned into a greeting word. So when I say away, I pull up my chin to give you something to greet you. And so this description in on radio, in public space, and describing it in the sort of the software and in the building of the dictionary was vitally important for us to reinforce that this decolonial act is also building knowledge about Kabs as a language that will be used and useful for the education system. One thing I want to point out that when Afrikaans got standardized, the question was, how do we write Afrikaans down? In this standardization process. That's not the question for the CARP speaker per se. It is about agency and voice. And if you produce a resource that can empower further the agency, that is the ability to bring about institutional change, and the voice, the ability to speak for the CARP speaker, you will forever transform the future of that particular speaker and how they see themselves, but also their own social life and that of their language.
Very well said. Gui?
Yeah, firstly, as someone who comes from the 18th century, and my encounter with the dictionary being made then by Dr. Johnson is actually very different from what became the OED. The idea is that, through Dr. Johnson's dictionary, the idea is also to use words as it is, able to be extended for wit, for social commentary. And it's already assumed that you understood the language when you're reading Johnson's dictionary, But then when it went to OED, it becomes something else. It really became less serious and really English words being put there in order that you can help or yourself learn the language. In other words, there is a strand in the creation of the English dictionary that is really tied to the project of colonialism. And in that light, when you talk about decolonializing, it has to be really rethinking the whole nature of what the OED ought to be doing, or dictionaries, English dictionaries itself ought to be doing. And I do agree with the strand, the trend that you're going now with, trying to include more words from different places as a way to empower all these different places. And that's my second point, because in Singapore, when we look to the OED, of course, it is a way to say that what we are saying in English is correct. But when we go to the OED and look at Singlish words, nobody really cared that whatever explanation you gave there, we know the meaning of those words. We see the word in the dictionary as an empowerment, that these words have value, they have certain muscle in a linguistic form. And so in Singapore, when people were to challenge the usefulness of Singlish or the power of Singlish, we just say, hey, those words are in OED. Your problem is not with me, Dr. Gui. Your problem is with the people in OED. And so there is that. But at the same time, we have to stop this, keep going on in this way, because it cannot be always that OED keeps absorbing all these words from Singlish. That is also a way of not actually decolonizing, but actually the opposite. It becomes a form that takes over what Singlish itself is. And therefore, we have to really, in a sense, within Singlish, create the possibility of empowering the language. Now, we already have a Singlish dictionary. It's called, in a funny way, Oxford Singlish Dictionary. It's play on the word Oxford. But you see, the interesting thing about that book that came out in the early 2000s is that people treat it as a book for fun. Nobody treat the OED as a book for fun. Nobody read it for laugh and to enjoy themselves. And but nobody treat the OED as a joke book, but the Oxford's Singlish dictionary, no, people just read it for those purposes. Now we have to, if we were to, in a sense, effectively decolonize English and empower Singlish, move away from that and be able to recognize that, Singlish itself is a language that can talk about itself. And that is not there in the earlier projects, because even in the Singlish, Oxford Singlish dictionary, they're using English words to define Singlish words. That's how it proceeds. Which is why when I came in with my explicit interest in talking about Singlish, I decided, why don't we just use Singlish to talk about Singlish? And this was my project with the Speaking Singlish book that came out in 2017. And it's very interesting because when I used it in the way I felt Dr. Johnson did it, which is to use the words and then you just talk in Singlish about the words, talk in Singlish about Singlish words, and use it as a mode for social commentary. Use it as a way to talk about things that you don't actually go to a dictionary for, which is opinions, social and political, economic, philosophical, all sorts of opinions. You go into those in English. It's very surprising because there's very strong negative reaction I get. People are saying that, it's horrible. Why are you doing this? You are trying to glamorize this inferior language. Are you trying to speak from your own socio-economic status and then trying to make something that is lowbrow look like it has a lot of potential? What are you trying to do, right? There's all this tension, resistance towards Singlish, a refusal to see that it has a beautiful future.
Yeah, I fully support the idea of a monolingual dictionary of Singlish. So let's now go to Phil. What do you think? What's your opinion?
Yeah, well, Gui, you just said about 90% of what I would like to say, and you said it much better. So maybe I just try to say something else, which is something we haven't talked about, which is really the whole OED project and imperialism, colonialism, and collection. Because, collection was collection of artifacts, of cultures and documentation and all of this stuff. These are very much tied up with kind of imperialist ideologies. So this whole idea really, if you, I really agree with what you said about, a Singlish word is in the Oxford English Dictionary. And what does that mean? It means it's been collected in a sense. Now, museums collect, there's all this stuff was collected from all over the world and put in the British Museum. And what's happening now is that the British Museum is starting to think about how do we give these things back?
Yes.
So I think in terms of dictionaries, English dictionaries, we have to try to somehow conceptualize how we can really reconceptualize what's the whole project about. We're not trying to collect all these words we're not trying to grab the hold of world Englishes and put it in one big book that we can keep in the Oxford University Library. What we're trying to do is do something which really sort of disseminates and brings the different varieties of English together. And to be honest, I think, what that means actually is many dictionaries. It doesn't mean one dictionary. I don't think decolonization means we need lots of different kinds of dictionaries, and those dictionaries should be able to communicate with each other in some way. And of course, the internet and sort of crowdsourcing and online networking and so on provides lots and lots of opportunities for that. And a lot of those opportunities, I think the OED is using already and moving in that direction. But I really think it's, as Guia said there, I think it's a question of rethinking what dictionaries are as much as.
And if I may, just 10 seconds, I wanted to say that if we're talking decolonization, having students or people from places that have used English for hundreds of years have to write test of English as a foreign language, I think is one of the big issues that have to be addressed. And these IELTS exams that are compelled to write. Usually people who have learned to use English for like 18 years of their lives before they left university, having to write the exam again to prove that they can speak the language, I think is one of the big, still colonial relics that need to be removed, especially because sometimes they write the exam and after 1 year they say it's expired, you have to write it again. Those are, I think, some of the big issues that still let you know, when even when you want to forget it, that in your English, the way you speak, is still not recognized in the global space as a kind of English. And when we're talking decolonization, I think that's a very big issue to address. Thank you.
Yeah,
I
so
think,
you all
Carla,
brought up some-
the spoken examination is particularly bad in
Yeah.
that respect, right?
Yeah,
Because it
that will
becomes a
all be
test of
discussed.
accent.
Yeah, that will all be discussed in our third panel today, which
Yeah.
will be about English language teaching and testing. So you've all made really, really good points, and I have nothing else to add to that really, apart from maybe the question of accessibility as well. So dictionaries have to be access to be of use to anybody. A dictionary that's with a single copy kept in a library somewhere will be of limited use to a limited number of people, and I guess you can also argue the same for dictionaries that are behind a paywall, but that's why. But that's why we're making it really a priority to examine how we can make our world English content more accessible to speakers of world Englishes. And one of the first steps we've taken towards this is the Varieties of English Hub on the OED's public pages, where we put all of our world English resources in one central repository so they can be accessible to anyone who is interested. And this question of accessibility applies not only to dictionaries but also to the English language as a whole. And because I feel really that English cannot be fully decolonized as long as the effective use of it is kept within a certain group of people. People of a certain race or a certain sex or a certain socioeconomic status. Which happens a lot in the Philippines, for example. So for English to really serve as a key to personal development and social mobility, for speakers in post-colonial nations, it has to be accessible to the majority. Otherwise it will just continue to be the language of the elite, just like during colonial times. But as you said, Kola, the key to greater accessibility of English really is effective teaching and learning, which takes into account all the linguistic repertoire of students using the language. And as I said, that will be a topic of discussion in our third panel today. So we have exactly 15 minutes left. So I think this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And I think we have a few minutes to answer questions from the audience. So I have one here that is inspired by one of the things that you said, Phil, which is your comment on the relationship between getting a job and speaking with a different accent. So Esther Kentish on the blog asks, so what do you think you should do to overcome this if it seems like a barrier in your progress? Because, we've all experienced that, having that wall in front of us of, oh, I can't go to that field because of my accent, So, Phil or anyone wants to comment on this?
I only mentioned that to really explain how I got interested in world Englishes. I don't, I mean, I think whatever difficulties in that respect I suffered are very small compared to the difficulties that the non-native speakers, and also sort of prejudices concerned with race and other aspects of identity. I don't think I'm the best person.
Yeah.
I mean, my strategy is simply to ignore it and try to get it. Yeah, I think Quentin wants to say something. Quentin wants to say something, I think.
Oh, Quentin, yes, please.
I think the example it applies to English as well, especially for the CAPS speaker who uses English as a second language. The association of CAPS with it being informal, a kitchen language associated to gangsters, a gangster language, impacts the young speaker to such a degree that he or she they are very aware of the accent that they use, right? They know it's a difference between not saying water and water, so dropping the vowels, and they are overwhelmed by this language ideology and suspicion that they are always put under, that they are afraid that they won't get jobs in the South African job market, where a particular English speaker with a particular education background is often required. And you see you see it in numerous examples, and you kind of really feel the pain of young speakers when they say, look, if I go to an interview and if I drop final erotic R's, immediately I will be looked in a different way on top of my black skin or colored skin, and I will be judged, and it will impact me for the rest of my life. I think there needs to be a concerted effort to address that particular problem. And dictionaries, and I like this idea that Phil mentioned about collecting, because collecting implies what you said, Phil, but also it shouldn't be an isolated project from the sort of the project of emancipation, or the project of rectifying or applying corrective measures in the society. Many other things need to now happen with the dictionary project: materials development, economic, linguistic landscaping. One of the wonderful examples, and I'll stop after this example. When I went to the government, the Western Cape government, I said to them that there are no signage in Kaap's. There are signage in English and isiXhosa and Afrikaans, standard Afrikaans, but not in Kaap's. The majority of the workers in the building that I stepped in, they are Kaap's speakers. So that they have a terminology list, and they can apply it or adjust it, but they need to do the work of really sort of the project work of bringing those voices into sort of mainstreaming of the spaces and society.
Now let's move on to another question from Claire Cowie, who's asking, what should the OED and regional dictionaries do about entries from First Nations or Indigenous languages that date from a time when Indigenous populations were being decimated, for example, in Australia and North America? So should these be glossed to highlight how this is viewed through a contemporary lens? I think I can take that question briefly, actually. So in the OED, we do have, this being a historical dictionary, and we work a lot on actual documents, historical documents. You see a lot of horrific things, especially me working as a world English editor, working with words from Africa and Asia that date back to the time of colonization, and you work with documents dating from the time. You really see a lot of the violence of this period of an abuse during this period of colonization, and this sometimes it express themselves through the words that we add to the OED. I remember working once on an entry for kipande, which is a word for an identity document formerly issued to Black Africans. It was really so when it was suggested, that word, it was just called an ID. So I thought, okay, it's like the word for passport. But when I studied the history of that word, it's actually quite a horrible system of controlling the movement of Africans during the time of colonization. And that is a history that we cannot just gloss over. We cannot define that word as simply an identification card. So the good thing about the OED is that this being a historical dictionary, you can actually express that history through the quotation paragraph. And there's also space to put a note where you say, this is, a definition of this, but also this system severely restricted the movement of Black Africans and enabled abusive labor practices and ethnic segregation. We can say that Africans protested against the system until it was abolished. So there's space to recognize all of that dark history. So we do that not only with post-colonial Englishes, but also varieties such as Claire mentioned, Australian Aboriginal English. But the only way that we can do that is to work with the communities that speak this variety, so they can tell us, how do you best represent, our variety of English in a way that is sensitive, that recognizes the past, but is also sensitive to the way that we use this language now as our language in the present. So that's, I think, the role that the OED can play in recognizing that history. Anybody else would like to comment? Or
can I claim a question that's being asked by Kingsley? Right. He asked there about, I guess, the kind of language structure that is happening institutionally in Singapore. I think I need to make this a bit clear. I mean, because it is a bit complicated in the schools. Everyone learns English and one of the ethnic languages, right? That I mean, are basically tied to your ethnicity. So, a Chinese person will have to learn Mandarin. A Malay person will have to learn Malay, and that's how a name as Tamil as a language also. And so there are all them altogether 4 official languages. Now that is on top of actually the language people speak at home, which is different. I mean, there are the Chinese dialects. There are also the various different other languages that you speak at home. So it's actually pretty interesting. Even though we call our second languages that are taught in school mother tongue languages, but for some of us, they're not really our mother tongue. Our mother was teaching us something else, was talking to us in some other languages. And so that is one complication regarding language in Singapore. The other one is the one you raised. You asked about Singapore English, whether anyone actually speak officially Singaporean English. That's an interesting thing because sometimes they don't even know that you're speaking Singaporean English. And that's the funny thing when I sometimes get criticized for Singlish and for talking about us celebrating Singlish, and these people are actually talking to me in Singaporean English or Singlish, and they don't realize that. Now that for me is the real problem when you cannot differentiate between the types of language you're speaking. And these are also often the same people who think that they can only speak one language when they don't realize they themselves are being fluid when they're speaking. And that's the issue. I think institutionally there has to be certain clarity that this is English, and all these other things, it could be influences from K-pop, but this is Singlish, or they could be internet English. I mean, there should be clarity of where all these things are coming from and what they're doing, rather than canceling them all out and saying that this is the only thing that you ought to be speaking.
It's very interesting. When in fact more people are multilingual than they are monolingual. But somehow the way it's just been ingrained in us from school that you have to be able to speak one language perfectly.
Which is why I feel like the whole project of self-awareness is important, at least in Singapore, to be realizing when you are speaking one thing and when you are speaking another thing, and what you're doing. I mean,
that's itself
know what they're doing.
I think we have time for. Oh, sorry. Did someone?
I was going to continue from where he stopped to address a question I saw here from Tanko Yusuf Atiku, who says, "Are we making a mockery of phonetics and phonology if we so-called decolonize English?" And I was going to also go back to something I'd wanted to say for a while to Prof. Benson, that in Nigeria we use submit as well. As when you want to hand in your work, we say submit. If you tell a Nigerian that people don't use submit in that way elsewhere, they're not going to. Most of them would disagree, or they unless you tell. There was just a couple of days ago, a friend of mine went on Twitter to ask us to give examples of Nigerian English, and I said next tomorrow, which is what we typically say when you want to talk about the day after tomorrow, next tomorrow. And somebody said, "Oh, really? This is Nigerian English?" I assumed it was just normal English. Of course, because there are many ways in which we have used the language naturally without assuming that everybody speaks like that. And I think that's a very interesting issue, which is why it's frustrating when we try all this work to make people look at it as important, to make Nigerians proud of the fact that they speak in this way. And then you get outside of the country and you realize that Nigerians that are fighting you still have to go through the same obstacle where everybody else outside the world then looks at them and says, "Oh, why are you speaking like that? You have to take a class of English and all of that." And then they realize, when they're already too late. So I don't think we're making a mockery at all. I think we're recognizing what is already a fact of life, that language changes, and that when people speak in a way and they have done so naturally for over many years, there's nothing wrong with it, and we shouldn't penalize it. And I would mention again to him that in Nigerian English, for instance, a common example is that we don't use schwa. The schwa sound, which is in English in above, across, doesn't quite exist in Nigerian English phonology. We open our mouths as wide as we can, above, alone. So if it's alone, we say alone. So it's a. If it's above, we say above, about, and all of that. And all Nigerians speak this way, but they don't know the consciousness of it until you get them to a classroom, and then you're teaching them about schwa, and students just look at you like, "What is a schwa?" And then you say, "Okay, this is a sound that comes before above," and they say, "Well, I say above. Why is that not ah?" And then you have to then reorient them into all that stuff. But normally everybody speaks with the vowels as clearly as possible. So I think the work is important. It's not a mockery. It's just recognizing the reality of the situation, and I think it's an important work. Thank you.
And really, it's phonetics and phonology exist to describe how people use sounds to create language. I mean, there's nothing that makes linguists and phoneticists happier than seeing something new to describe. So it's not making a mockery of phonology or phonetics, and it's actually enriching it. I mean, if you see the OED has been adding pronunciation models of different varieties of English for quite a few years now, and it only serves to enrich the dictionary rather than limit it. So yeah, it's a really good thing. I mean, there's so many other very, very interesting questions, but I'm afraid that we have to wrap up soon. So we have a couple of, we have 1 minute. So I just want to just spend that 1 minute just to say, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Gui, Phil, Quentin, Kola, for joining me today. So I would just like to close by quoting a Filipino writer called Hemino Abad, who once said that English is now ours. We have colonized it too. And I think that's beautiful. That's how we should decolonize English, is to make it ours, make it our own, colonize it. And I'm so glad that I've had this hour and a half with all of you to talk about how exactly we can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.